Is 2025 just 1848 with the worst soundtrack? What's the difference between a revolution and a civil war? And are we about to find out? All across Europe, the delusions of our political class are actively starting to break things. Dirty tricks are being played. The democratic apple cart is wobbling. In France, Marine Le Pen has been banned from standing for election. Germany, the talk is still of banning the AfD, even as a grand coalition of left and right shuts them out of power. And in Britain, rather than deal with the true sources of their security crisis, the country is in the midst of a bizarre national debate over a fictional TV show about incels. In Britain, a war studies professor has been doing the media rounds arguing that the country already fits the bill for a nation in a pre-Civil War state. Forget the Russian front. It might be that, in the words of David Baetz at the Munich Security Conference, the real threat comes from within. Here in Budapest, we've known our share of civil strife. Our 1848 was one of the great liberal revolutions. But that version of liberalism was about trusting the people. And that's what European leaders seem to be actively against. Instead, the EU is obsessed with monitoring the internet precisely because the political class can no longer shape reality. They can only shape the perception of reality. Do these bourbons clamoring for cake know what's about to hit them? Delusions, democracy, and the threat from within. This time on View from the Danube. Welcome back to View from the Danube. I'm joined today by Gavin Haynes, a visiting fellow here at the Danube Institute, by John O'Sullivan, who is the president of the Danube Institute, and our special guest today is Matthew Goodwin, who writes a very important Substack covering politics, culture, and such like in Great Britain. Matt, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with addressing the nuclear bomb that has gone off in the world economy in the past days. Trump's tariffs, his global tariffs regime. What do you think Trump intends by this? Is he trying to depreciate the dollar? Does he want to drive down interest rates? Does he just love tariffs? Or is he trying to screw the Chinese? Or maybe all of these things? John, what do you take?
Well, I think maybe all of these things in succession, because already he's had to make some changes. And it was a very big, bold move. But I think myself, his main aim is to get everybody else with him against China, or as many countries as he can against China. And that's, in a sense, what's beginning to happen. I don't know how well this is going to go, because he has received a check. Really the first check he's received. By a check, I mean an obstacle in his way. Since he became president, he's had a very good run. The changes he's made have been broadly welcomed by his supporters, and the opposition from the Democrats has been so excessive that it's discredited itself. So I think this is the first time he's come up against something, and what he's come up against is the reaction of the markets. In the past, that's done things like, for example, it completely reversed Francois Mitterrand's move to socialism in the 80s. Will it do the same here? And my view of that is it won't. This is essentially a system, the check will be a part of the refinement of Trump's policy, in which he gets the other countries to he rebalances the trade with all of the other countries, but he does so in order to get them on his side against China. And I think this is a step in that direction. But because he has inevitably been somewhat weakened by this first obstacle of the markets, he's going to have to proceed a little more carefully.
Matt, your take.
Yeah, so what I found quite interesting is the way in which Trump has become a symbol of the longer-term critique of globalization, or hyper-globalization, as some have called it, that we know that pretty much from the 90s until today, the working class in Western economies was smashed by two things. One was the offshoring of jobs, wages, factories to China, to developing nations, but also they were smashed on top of that by the importation of mass uncontrolled immigration by Western elites into their societies. And so on one level, at least, I think Trump is obviously trying to stage a global economic reset, but he's trying to do this, I think, in a way, and J.D. Vance certainly is trying to do this in a way that addresses this longer-term critique of globalization, that reasserts the primacy of working people within this system. Whether they'll pull it off, I don't know, but that critique, I think, has been consistently downplayed by economists, the expert class, by Western elites pretty much since the 1990s. And I do find it ironic that people who are most critical of the Trump tariffs today are not only the same people who often presided over the global financial crash in 2008, but are also many of the same people who told us, I remember them, I'm sure you do, who told us in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, globalization, the liberalization of finance would lift all boats. And actually, it turns out it didn't. It lifted some boats, but it smashed the working class. And are they going to be better off as a result of this 5 years, 10 years down the line? I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. But as John said, in the polling, a lot of MAGA voters, Republican voters, 75% plus, say actually they do think this is going to work out for them, and they are willing to take a short-term economic cost. The last point, if I may, there's a parallel with Brexit here. Everybody said at the time, voters will quickly lose support for Brexit once the economic shock becomes visible. And there was a short-term shock after Brexit. We did see some market fluctuations. We didn't see the apocalypse that George Osborne and David Cameron predicted. But what happened with those Leave voters, Rod, actually they stayed remarkably loyal to the project for many years afterwards. They still are. That's why Nigel Farage is still frontline British politics. It's why the post-Brexit realignment is still just about visible. And I think the parallel here when it comes to America is, these Trump voters will stay loyal to this, so long as they believe it's going to push America in the right direction.
Gavin.
It's an act of creative destruction, isn't it? And I can't entirely see what the logic is in terms of getting from we have tariffs to American industry reinflates. And, having studied economics, you kind of go through the seminary school version of Ricardian comparative advantage. And, I believe in the post-liberal project. I believe in sort of a rebalancing between the classes, etc., and the Trumpian project in that sense. It's just not quite clear what the transmission mechanism is. And I think this week I've had to kind of revisit the idea of tariffs and what tariffs mean and how that works out. And it hasn't immediately come to me that you can get back to America in, I don't know, the 70s or 80s by doing this.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me when Trump announced his global tariffs is how indiscriminate they were. A friend of mine back in America owns a small business, a big Trump supporter, but suddenly she was faced with her business collapsing overnight. She's a florist. She imports flowers from Latin America. Most of the flowers, cut flowers, into the U.S. come from Latin America. You can't quickly reestablish an American supplier for these things. So here's florists. The floral business is a low-margin business. The upshot was, if her business collapsed overnight, how does she feed her kids? And this was the sort of thing that took her in 1 week from being glowing about the glories of what Trump has done to despising the man. Now, I think she's calmed down since Trump backed off on the tariffs, but the point is simply this, it's not going to happen, this rebalance, without pain. We know that, but you can't destroy the Main Street businesses that you say that you're supporting for the sake of the larger abstraction. And that's something I think Trump really has to worry about.
Well, I think that's true. But again, you've pointed to this yourself. I think there are inevitably, with any project that's about a reset, economic or political, there is always going to be things that are broken, things that are going to have to take a cost in order to get to the longer term destination. I mean, the example that we had in the UK was lorry drivers after Brexit. Suddenly all the lorry drivers had gone and we were short of lorry drivers. And everybody said, well, how can you smash the haulage industry? The answer is we hadn't trained enough British people to become lorry drivers. We hadn't improved working conditions and we hadn't improved pay. Now, the elite class had a meltdown. Well, look, this is ruining an industry. No one's talking about that anymore. Why? Because the industry corrected itself. It started paying people properly. It started improving working conditions. Now, I'm not saying that everything in the UK, well, nothing in the UK is perfect currently, but there are going to be, in America, if you're going to go for this global reset, there are going to be short-term costs. And I think Trump is taking a punt. He's taking a bet that the American people will put up with those short-term costs over the next 1, 2, 3 years in order to get to that longer-term structural readjustment. And I do think the transmission mechanism that Gavin asked about, I do think we're already partly beginning to see some of that in some of the decisions that are being taken by large corporates, global companies to relocate, to start bringing some factories back. I think J.D. Vance has made this argument that since the 1990s, 90,000 factories were shut across the US. Some of those now beginning to come back in some sense. It's not going to be a 1950s vision of industry, but it will be one that's a bit more about chips and so forth. I think it's wait and see. I think let's just wait and see where this takes us.
Well, there is another point too, I think, that from the 80s onwards, in fact, from the 70s onwards, we inflicted 2 experiments on the American economy. The one is, as you say, the globalization of goods. But there's also the globalization of people. And the globalization of people is much more destructive, in my view, of the existing opportunities for American workers than the globalization of goods, and much more destructive generally. Why? Because if you buy goods from abroad, if you bring in goods from abroad, you don't bring in the families of the worker. You don't need more housing. You don't need more educational investment. And the workers, unless they're very high skilled, don't add value to the degree that all those things get paid for in the long run. And this point was made actually by one of the purest of pure market economists, and that was, well, several of them. Milton Friedman said this about the welfare state. Henry Simon, one of the founders of the Chicago School, said, absolute movement of free movement of goods makes everyone richer. You disagree with that. But I think, he goes on to say, absolute freedom of movement makes everyone poorer. And I'm not sure that's completely true. But nonetheless, it is true that if you take an economy and you make it completely open to trade and completely open to immigration, you impose very, very serious 2 kinds of stress. And then on top of that, if you bring in net zero as well, which actually everybody agrees is going to reduce living standards, you're expecting the capitalist economy to take burden after burden after burden, and still the poor old nag is going to walk up the hill. I think that's what we have been forgetting in this period.
Yeah, I'm shocked by the way, well, I'm not shocked, if I'm honest, about the way the elites are responding to all this, because they've told themselves for 30 or more years that this is the way, globalization is the way, and now suddenly it's not the way, and they're powerless to do anything about it because the people voted Donald Trump in. I'm reminded of something that happened about 25 years ago. I used to be on the editorial board of the Dallas Morning News in Texas, and mass migration was a huge issue then. We were always talking about it. And one thing struck me is that my colleagues there were all middle-class people, who lived in decent suburbs and so forth. We could only see migration in terms of the benefits it gave us, better restaurants, better lawn care, that sort of thing. But we didn't see the cost on working class people, including Latinos and Black people in our own city. Their schools were overwhelmed, their public schools. They had no choice to send their kids to a private or parochial school. Their schools were overwhelmed with children who spoke Spanish and had no capacity in English, and they still were entitled to an education. How were the American children ever going to learn in that situation? The public hospitals overwhelmed with illegal migrants, such that poor Americans couldn't get treatment, and so on and so forth. But these people were invisible to the cheerful middle-class colleagues of mine, and to myself as well, except when I would go out and actually talk to them. the working class in America has been unseen by those in the leadership institutions for 30 years or so, and now they've shown up in a rather crude way, and the elites don't know what to do.
Well, I remember that line in was it Christopher Lasch who said the next big revolution won't be the masses rising up against the elites, but the elites rising up against the masses. And I think that's what you're seeing playing out across Western democracies today through the censorship industrial complex, through, as John said, this sort of hysterical reaction to something that I think has been obviously coming for many of us who have been watching global politics for the last 20, 30 years. It was obvious that the liberal consensus more broadly is under attack from citizens who do not believe it is working out for them economically, socially, and culturally. And that has been coming, I really think, since the 1980s. I mean, you know, I remember countries like Austria, France, Italy, through the 90s, you could begin to see this rebellion really beginning to pick up. And then as we went into the 2000s, before the global financial crash, we had signs of it in the UK. We had Nigel Farage doing well in 2004, among others. Trump and Brexit then explode in 2016. Now we see Germany going in a similar direction. To me, this is all part of a 30-year pushback to this liberal consensus that has been imposed on people by this luxury belief class that is advocating policies they're not going to have to suffer the consequences of. So, and in a way, their shock reflects just how insular and how isolated from the rest of society they've become. Like, how could you not see this coming?
And their shock is in part because they control, gosh, this sounds so Marxist, they control the means of information production such that they are only talking to themselves. I was telling Matt earlier that a couple of weeks ago, I received a phone call from an American journalist based in London who writes for the Wall Street Journal. And he was working on a piece about why conservative Americans are turning more and more against Europe. And I told him, yeah, you're always going to have people in America who just hate Europe for no particular reason. But one reason intelligent, informed conservatives are becoming angrier at Europe and the UK is because of the things we see on social media, things that are true, not fake news, that never make it into publications like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. In particular, things happening in Britain. I brought up the case of Isabel Vaughan Spruce. She's a Catholic pro-life campaigner in Britain who was arrested not once, but twice for praying silently in the vicinity of an abortion clinic. She had no signs, no nothing. She was just standing there. And we have on video the police arresting her for the thoughts in her head. Now, this journal reporter didn't know who Isabel Vaughan Spruce was. So many people I know in America who saw all this on Twitter, they know who she is. And I think there's a lesson there about how the elites trying to control the information think they can stop what's happening.
Just briefly, if I may, there's what I think is an even more powerful example of that, which is the rape gang scandal in the UK. So in January, the legacy media were up in arms about the fact that Elon Musk had dared to draw attention to this scandal because, like lots of North Americans, he was saying, wait a minute, sorry, young, white, working class girls are being raped, abused, trafficked, in some cases murdered by Pakistani Muslim gangs and have been since the 1980s.
Thousands of them.
No. One Labour MP says since the 1980s, perhaps 1 million young girls have been abused across England's towns. And Elon Musk has said, in response to some court transcripts going viral, how is this possible? Legacy media in Britain were then up in arms. How is this Trump ally causing all of this problem? When the real question is, actually, if legacy media had been doing its job, if legacy media had been pursuing truth and taking the rumours of this scandal seriously since the 1980s, it would not have taken and needed Elon Musk to intervene in that national debate. It is probably going to go down in history as the biggest scandal, I think, in British history. We've still not fully reckoned with it. Even today, as we're talking, the Labour government is doing everything it can to downplay a serious investigation. It's not committed to a national inquiry. And I don't want to turn this conversation into that conversation, but I would just leave viewers with one thought experiment. Can you imagine how the elite class would have responded if it had been revealed that gangs of white working class men had been going into Muslim communities, had been giving Muslim girls heroin, cocaine, and alcohol, had been gang raping them, had been trafficking them to other towns, had been saying they were only doing that precisely because they were Muslim, because many of the gangs were doing this because these girls were white, and they've all said that to their victims. Could you imagine how the elite class would respond to that? We would never have heard the end of it. It would have been Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, Stephen Lawrence on steroids. Nobody out there knows the names of these girls. Lucy Lowe, Charlene Downs, Victoria Agoglia. Everybody knows George Floyd. Nobody knows those names. It's absolutely outrageous.
By the way, some of those girls who were treated not only by their rapists, but also by the police and the authorities as slags, sluts, morally worthless people whom we don't need to protect. And except for an absurd Home Office pamphlet which said that they were making a legitimate lifestyle choice to be raped and so on, absurd. But in addition to that, we now know that many of those girls, you've mentioned their names, but there are others, have turned out to be very brave, independent-minded, clearly active moral agents who are trying to both have rescued themselves and are now trying to rescue other people, and to do so in a way which requires a lot of courage for someone who's from a poor and vulnerable background. So I do think this is a scandal of extraordinary proportions, and it's going to have longer legs than the politicians would like, precisely because the victims turn out to be admirable people, and this is something we shouldn't forget, and we should remember that the so-called underclass, even, and we're often talking about that here, but particularly also the white working class. The idea that these people are somehow knuckle-dragging, low people who have got racist drives, this is absolutely absurd to anyone who's from a working-class background or indeed is working class today. I mean, we know that that our fellow citizens are much better people, much stronger moral agents than many of the people at the top of politics. And yet, this is not the view that's put across in the media or in other ways. And I think these things are very important. We have to respect our fellow citizens. And in this case, they turn out to be worthy of respect.
Well, Gavin, explain how this could have happened. What is the mentality that allows the elites in the UK to sweep these young women under the rug and not see what's right in front of them?
Just an absolute cordon sanitaire. The idea of what it is to be racist in Britain, to be outside of that progressive bubble. Britain is a very kind of parochial society. It's a very polite society, and you will get the very subtle nudges very quickly when you slip over that line. I was a journalist in the UK for a while. Sometimes you pitch things that are a little bit up on the wire, and those pitches just never land, etc., etc. I think last year I tried to pitch something to BBC Radio 4, which was about justice projects where someone was got off by the Justice Project and then they went on to kill again. And, that to me is like it's a story. Radio 4 stuff, but, that sort of fell on stony ground. And just time and again, it's not even an elite class. It's just a sort of a broad social stratum that feels that this is beyond the pale. And I see in recent weeks that is being nudged. Yeah. But the media complex in Britain is so strong in that regard, and so singular and so London-centric, and they all and
so highly miseducated.
I think what unites them, though, is a very specific view of multiculturalism, and I think we need to be clear about what's going on. And it's this idea of asymmetrical multiculturalism. So you can promote and protect every minority group, racial, sexual, ethnic, gender, religious minority group, but you are instinctively suspicious of the majority, which is seen to be problematic, which is seen to be inherently dangerous. This idea has run through British and English culture for centuries. In the 1990s, there was a moral panic among the elite class over football hooliganism, which was also used to discredit the white working class. And today, with the Netflix drama Adolescence, I would argue we're seeing something similar. On the one hand, ordinary men and women in England and Britain are talking about the rape gang scandal. How was it possible that hundreds of thousands of young white working class girls were abused by Pakistani Muslim gangs? The elite class is having a very different conversation, which is, well, white working class boys are inherently threatening and problematic and they might stab your children. And here's a Netflix drama that is now being treated as a documentary by our own Prime Minister, when in actual fact, in the empirical world, the boy in this drama, a white boy from a two-parent family, statistically is the least likely of all to permit this kind of crime. The exact kind of person that is most likely to commit this crime is actually a member of a minority group from a broken home, probably from London, who has been drawn into street gangs. But we're not given the empirical reality. We're given this project that is designed to try and socially reconstruct our reality.
But before we switch to the docudrama point, which I think is very important, but nonetheless, on the rape gangs, we have to also accept one of our fellow citizens include now millions of Muslims, and they're not going away, and therefore they're going to be our fellow citizens for a long time to come. Now, they must be very worried by what's come out about the rape gangs. Obviously, it inflicts shame on the Muslim community, which, of course, is a Muslim society being essentially an honor society. This is a very grave thing, as we know. Now, how do we, in a sense, address the concerns, the safety concerns, the anxieties of that community without, at the same time, giving it the unjustified protection? I don't mean police protection. I mean the protection. We don't want to hurt people's feelings is essentially one of the driving elements of the response you're talking about. And I think what we have to do here is find a way of addressing them honestly and realistically, and eliciting from them. And there are there are a lot of Muslims who would be happy with this. But in a curious way, we have to address words of solidarity and comfort to them, with words of genuine criticism of elements of their religion, which it seems to me might, in a sense, make this kind of treatment of these white girls acceptable to them, which we obviously don't think it should be.
Just briefly, if I may, there are just two statistics that are worth reflecting on. The UK government, under the Conservatives and endorsed by Labour, agreed to put aside £171 million to protect mosques and Muslim schools in Britain. £171 million. They made available £5 million for the 5 local inquiries into the grooming gang scandal. So in Britain, we're having a very lively discussion about our two-tier society, some groups being favoured over others. So we need to address that. But you're absolutely right. I think the rape gang scandal was actually an enormous opportunity for the British Muslim community to come together, to raise their heads above the parapet and say, we condemn this action and we do not stand with these vile gangs. Unfortunately, until now, maybe things will change. My personal view is they squandered that opportunity because they were not vocal enough in the national debate. There should have been, I think, some sort of British Muslim alliance all over mainstream media saying, we call this out as loudly as you do. And actually, instead, there was relative silence. And that was noticed, I think, by a lot of people.
And that is absolutely fair, but it's also, in a way, our fault, because remember Theresa May said after an atrocity of some kind, we have to have uncomfortable conversations. But the only one she really was prepared to have was one about criticising, attacking, banning Islamophobia. This has now been reiterated by the present Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Now, in a way, we have to confront Islamophobia. We have to confront also criticism phobia. We have to be willing to say there are aspects of your religion which are incompatible with our society. The Italian Prime Minister has just said it: free speech, freedom of religion. Apostates in a Muslim teaching and culture are worthy of being executed. We have to not just simply say, that's not going to happen here. We have to say it's wrong anywhere. And in a way, we are not prepared to do that, even though one of the most striking, unnoticed phenomena at the moment of our time all over Europe is the number of Muslims who are converting to Christianity. Why are they doing this? Some of them are having encounters in dreams and near-death experiences with Christ. I don't dismiss those, obviously not. I am a Christian, and secondly, I think there's something in near-death experiences which is genuine. It's not just as the brain going haywire as you're dying. And so I think that's interesting and important. I don't think it can be the basis for a policy, don't get me wrong. But it does mean that in the Muslim community, whether through spiritual experiences or whether through, in a sense, living in a Christian society based originally on Christianity, that there are things about this society which are very appealing and which they begin to be wanting to adopt themselves. So I think we're in a very key moment here, and the only way we can go forward is by brutal honesty about the differences between us, combined with a genuine solidarity, concern, and I suppose I have to say it, love for the other.
Well, I don't know if I hope it happens, but I think what we're seeing from the elites is rather a policy of trying to clamp down on all information to construct reality. This podcast is going out to a lot of people in America, and there's so much news that happens in the UK and Europe that never makes it into the American newspapers or networks. One of these stories is the one of Lucy Connolly, which is a perfect example of how the elites in Britain are trying to squash any information that doesn't suit their narrative. I want to ask you, Matt, to tell our listeners, our viewers, who is Lucy Connolly and why does her case matter?
Yeah, so I actually wrote about this case last week because I was so shocked when I read the original, the events. Lucy Connolly is a young mother and the wife of a husband who is actually very sick. And in the aftermath of the Southport atrocities,
the murder
of three little girls by Axel Ruda-Cabana last August,
son of migrants from Africa,
from Rwanda. In the immediate hours after that, Lucy Connolly got out her phone and tweeted, something that many people will find offensive. She essentially said, if it makes me racist to, want these people out of my country, to basically, if that makes me racist, then so be it. Right. And what we've since discovered, by the way, is a few months before the Southport atrocity, Lucy Connolly actually lost a baby herself in very traumatic circumstances and was diagnosed with PTSD. So the point I'm making is, now we know this information, it's quite clear that she may have struggled as well to process the murder of three little girls, and she instantly took to social media. She left that tweet up for 4 hours, and then she thought better of herself and she deleted it, and she hoped it would go away. By then people had taken screenshots, had sent them to the police. She was given a prison sentence. She was sent to jail for nearly 3 years for basically inciting hate. And what's remarkable as we're talking today, in April 2025, well, technically Lucy Connolly, because of good behaviour and so forth, she actually has become eligible for temporary release, which would allow her to go and see her daughter, who we read is misbehaving in school, is struggling with the absence of her mother.
And her sick
husband. And the police authorities have denied her that temporary leave because they say there is so much media and public interest in her case that they are refusing to give her temporary leave. Now, on the one hand, this isn't just about Lucy Connolly. This is about 13,000 people being arrested by police in the last year alone for so-called speech crimes. This is about 133,000 people since 2014 being given things that are called non-crime hate incidents, where people will...
So it sounds Orwellian.
Well, it is. A non-crime hate incident for the Americans watching is, if we finish this conversation and I leave the room and you call the police and you say, Matt Goodwin just said something that offends me, in the UK, they will write up a case a black mark will be put next to my record. And if I go for a job in the future, let's say a public service job, they will ask for my record and they will see that Matt Goodwin was given a non-crime hate incident, and you don't even need to give them any evidence of that. It's just your perception. That's a non-crime hate incident. So Lucy Connolly has become the latest symbol of what J.D. Vance pointed to and nobody in Europe wanted to hear, nobody in the elite class, which is we do have a free speech crisis going on, especially in the UK, because of our hate laws and because of our censorship industrial complex. It's very clear. I'm not exaggerating that. It's actually happening.
Oh, you're not. And it's happening not just in the UK, but in continental Europe. It's often the case, though, that we don't see it or hear about it because it's happening in a language that's not English. But if you go into France, if you go into Germany or whatever, these things are happening. People are being put away for saying things that offend the official narrative.
Well, we had two parents the week before who were arrested by 6 police officers, and their crime was that they had complained about a local school in a parents' WhatsApp group,
right,
and somebody perceived that to be offensive. 6 police officers. I've lived in Britain since 1981. I've never seen 6 police officers together except at riots. They went to the house of the parents. They had a camera, so it was recorded. 6 police officers came, arrested them, put them in jail, took them away from their young daughter for 8 hours because they'd complained about a school in a WhatsApp group.
Okay, now we need to talk about where this might be leading. About 6 weeks ago, David Baetz, he's a professor in the War Studies Department at King's College London. He studies civil wars, as that's his academic field. He gave an extraordinary interview on Louise Perry's podcast. The interview in which he talks about how all the conditions for civil war are present now in the UK. And not just in the UK, he said, across Western Europe. By civil war, he doesn't mean one army against another. He means things like the Troubles in Northern Ireland about sectarian or inter-ethnic conflict, bombings, atrocities, that sort of thing. He says that it could easily be set off in the UK or anywhere in Europe. And he says because of social media, if it goes off in one place, it will go off everywhere. And he says it will likely be country people against city people, you know. And so this podcast went viral. It's had over 200,000 page views now, and Tim Stanley wrote about it in The Telegraph. Now, when I was traveling in France recently and talking to people there, they're also talking about, French people, about the possibility of civil war. I spoke to a retired senior military officer, a general, who said, oh, yes, it's coming. I told them about the David Baetz podcast, and they said, oh, yeah, absolutely. But this has so far not made it into any kind of official conversation. Do you think that we are running a risk of civil war? And by the way, I should say, Baetz said that everything the Starmer government is doing in the UK is by the book, according to British military doctrine, to spark a civil war. And again, not just the UK, but all over Europe.
Yeah, well, it's to spark a civil war, and it's also to repress the societal forces that are kind of bulging and twisting underneath that. There was a moment about a year ago now where Rishi Sunak, the then Prime Minister, came out to the podium in Downing Street, which is a very rare event, one Friday night. And I was like, what is he going to say? What is he going to say? And he gave this sort of rather kind of blandishing speech about multiculturalism and like the threat from within. And it was never quite clear what he meant from that. But I've always wondered about the briefings that are accessible to the British Prime Minister and how, you know, maybe MI5 or forces within the security state are thinking about this question and are, you know, after Southport, I think is maybe the instructive case in point. Keir Starmer comes out and clamps down hard. Keir Starmer's a bit of a know-nothing overall. I think someone behind him said, if you do not do this, this and this and this will happen, you know, and a bit like, I don't know, when there was some currency crisis with Maloney or whatever, and the men from the central bank or the bond markets come along and say, look here, you do this or else. And, you know, you look at Lucy Connolly and, you know, the stuff that Matt has been talking about. Lucy Connolly is effectively a political prisoner. You know, you could see when she is released, I wonder whether there will be crowds there to greet her, etc.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, of course, there are other people in prison too, who many are watching quite closely, and wrongly in my view, but they view them as political prisoners. I mean, just think about the conditions that you rightly point to. You have mass uncontrolled immigration. There is no democratic mandate for that. You have borders that are broken. We have 157,000 mainly young Islamic men entering the country illegally since 2018, and nobody in government can competently respond to that and control that. We have a two-tier legal and justice system, which, as we're talking in April 2025, it's just been revealed not only that the Sentencing Council wanted to basically give preferential treatment to minorities, but is blocking white candidates from going for jobs at the same time as people from minority backgrounds. You have an estimated 40,000 radical Islamists already living in the UK, some of whom we saw in weeks, months on end protests of people singing anti-Semitic songs and celebrating Hamas on the streets of London, and the police did absolutely nothing about it. And the thing about Southport is the interesting thing for me was not so much Keir Starmer's response, which was classic textbook authoritarian progressivism: shut down free speech, expand non-crime hate incidents, throw hundreds of people into prison, arrest thousands more. That's classic left-wing radical progressivism, right? That didn't surprise me. What surprised me about Southport was how quickly people took to the streets. It was within hours, and it was sporadic, and it was everywhere. And even though the state said, well, this is an organised far right, everybody knew that was nonsense. We have no organised far right. So what they tried to insist on was this was a highly orchestrated campaign, run on Telegram, run on Signal, and it's Tommy Robinson's fault and it's Nigel Farage's fault. Now, what they missed in that analysis is it wasn't. It was completely organic. The people at those protests were fairly ordinary men and women, some children too. There was a violent element to it, but it was organic. And if I was the state looking at that, that is what would terrify me, that so many people instantly took to the streets in response to that case.
Now, the next day, none of those things happened again. Now, why is that? In other words, everyone was predicting the next day was going to be worse. And then there were large left-wing demonstrations to prevent this happening. Well, it didn't happen. And actually, they weren't there to prevent it happening. They were there to, so to speak, respond to it. But there was no one to respond to because people stayed at home. They thought, well, we're not going to go out and fight people and find ourselves with fighting the cops and all that. This is ridiculous. We're staying home. Now, I think this is a very important factor. In Britain, and particularly in England, rather than Scotland, in particular in England, there is a very deep aversion to violence. Yeah. It is really built into English culture. Now, I'm not saying there haven't been mobs, the Gordon riots and so on in the past. There have been. But nonetheless, there is a strong, I mean, even in bars, bar fights in England tend to be nothing like bar fights in parts of Scotland. I mean, they just aren't. They don't produce the same kind of number of deaths and that kind of thing. Now, I therefore think that the civil war that you're predicting is like your second description of it, the one in which there are not armies fighting or anything like that, but you have a long-running troubles situation. I think that is a terrible situation, but it's not, I think, what most people think of as civil war, and I think they're right not to think of it as civil war. I think, secondly, if you're correct, and I think you probably are, that these conditions are repeated in lots of other countries, there will be some country that actually has a very serious civil war, or a semi-revolutionary situation, which is hard to distinguish, in which soldiers get involved. I think, as the Spanish Civil War also, I think, had this effect, other people will look at that and say, we don't want that here. That will be another factor. So I think the forces of disorder, the forces of law being sympathetic to some kinds of disorder. It's very obvious, for example, that though Lucy Connolly ended up in prison, a man who the next day, a left-wing Labour councillor and union leader, who actually called on a group of people to slit the throats of the far right and so on. That is direct incitement to violence against particular people.
And
so
what
on.
happened to him?
Nothing at all. Well, he hasn't yet been tried. It's been postponed and postponed and postponed. I think it's fair to say people are expecting that he'll get a very light sentence if he gets a prison sentence at all. Now, that is the real danger. And against that danger, it seems to me the biggest advantage the people in the end have is the ballot box. But unfortunately, that's not going to be available to them for the next 4 years.
John, can I just push back on you in one sense?
Of course, yeah.
The point about British English culture, so in the classic book, Civic Culture by Armand and Verber, they did say we are not like continental Europeans in the sense that we really do not like messianic, polarized, populist figures, if you like. But they also said that was because the Brits and the English were very deferential to authority, and they had deference that was sort of hardwired into their culture. But what happens when that authority, as we are now seeing, becomes so deeply politicized, so obviously biased, so obviously discredited, where public trust is at all-time lows, and people are looking at the authority figures and they're saying, well, you can't control the borders, you can't deliver a vibrant economy, you're giving preference to some groups over others, you're enabling sectarianism in our society. We now have Muslim candidates running at national general elections on issues around Gaza, not issues around Britain. We just had a bunch of members of parliament in predominantly diverse seats campaigning for an airport in Pakistan, some of whom were from Birmingham, where their own council has gone bankrupt and they cannot get the rubbish off the streets, but they decided that was the moment to campaign for an airport in Pakistan. So sectarianism, as in Northern Ireland, sectarianism, I would argue, is already visible. So what happens when people are no longer willing to be deferential to the established authority?
Well, I would say, too, that David Baetz in his podcast spoke of what he called normalcy bias. And he said this is a danger in Britain, and I would say probably everywhere else. The idea that this is all still what's happening now is all still part of the normal run of things, and that we can control it in the end. It will never happen here. And Baetz said this could be a sort of blindness that prevents us from doing what is necessary, the actual things to keep it from happening here, because we can't imagine that it would.
Well, Nassim Taleb talks about this in the intro to his book, Black Swan, where, he's Lebanese and he grew up in a sort of peaceful and prosperous Lebanon. And then bit by bit, drip by drip, suddenly it's 1982 and there's full-blown civil war. And obviously that's the sort of thesis of the entire book, is that like these things can come along and change and people have this normalcy bias.
Well, you see, I think what happens, it's a very fair attack. Okay, I'm perfectly happy with that attack. Okay.
Critique.
Critique. Now, what does happen is this. And I would say it is when there is a feeling that the authorities are on the side of injustice. That's a very important element in that argument. And when that happens, what you have is one of two things. Either you do have a action in the streets, rebellions, police attack and so on. The other is that you basically say it's an unfair world. The things I took for granted in the past are not true of this country. It's a terrible thing. And then you do nothing. You submit. But remember, eventually there are tests for the government, the election. And in those circumstances, what you have is the preference cascade, as it's called. The moment when people they lie to the authorities, they lie to the representatives as they see them, the pollsters, but when they go, they vote for a revolutionary response.
Or they don't vote at all. So we have a Labour government with one of the biggest majorities in history, but on the lowest share of the vote for any incoming government for about a century. And I do think there's a stage in this that we're missing. I remember Robert Putnam at Harvard, who's a sort of centre-left academic. Yeah. He wrote a paper about 15 years ago in which he basically said, empirically he showed this, even though he was attacked widely by academics. He said, when you subject subject people to rapid demographic change. The end result was lower social trust, and people, in his famous words, hunker down. They turn away from the collective project. They become less willing to support the welfare state. They become less willing to support the social contract. When I look at my country, I've been in England since 1981, okay? I would say that is the phase we now have, which is people just hunkering down, turning away from this collective project. Yes, the elite class talks about how the Olympics brought us together in 2012 and how diversity is our strength and all of this stuff. But as Fukuyama said, if the elite class is turning your whole identity into a celebration of diversity, it's also like saying you have no real identity of your own. Right. And many people are picking up on that. So I would suggest we're not in this civil war, low-level tit-for-tat violence. I would say France probably is. Where I think we are is in a phase of atomization. You've just got different communities self-segregating. You know, I wrote a piece recently on the 10 most segregated areas in Britain, where you have large numbers of people from outside of the UK hoovering up most of the social housing, not identifying with Britishness or Englishness, and not even speaking the language. So you're just going to see a proliferation of that, with the dominant majority population increasingly becoming aware of the fact that in 2060, 2065, they will no longer be the majority population. And with this, as Gavin rightly points to, this kind of creep of this two-tier society. Now, whether that pushes us into another phase, let's wait and see. But I think we're already in that Putnam phase of people just hunkering down.
We can't leave this topic yet. No, we can't, because something has happened, which is to say that the Conservative government lost precisely because it ceased to be easily identifiable as in favour of the whole society, but certainly with the majority. It became a kind of nervous guardian of minorities against the majority, which you were rightly critiquing before as both false and dangerous. Now, the Conservative Party is no longer the sole Conservative Party, and you have two Conservative parties. Both of them are now significantly more vocal in the defence of a democratic populace in an ideological way, which they didn't exist before. Reform was too small. And that it means the debate is suddenly a very serious one, and one that the government itself has to be nervous of, because it's going to be losing what remains of its working class supporters, the blue collar vote, if it doesn't begin to be a credible representative of the majority as well as the minority. Now, I don't think they will become that credible representative, because they're too divided, and anyway, they don't have the instincts that would support them in their own gut. Now, so what that means is the next democratic set of elections going down are going to be a battle between people who say this is a damn good country and we want to defend it, which will include minorities, significant numbers of minorities, particularly, of course, Hindus and Sikhs above all.
Like the blacks and Latinos who voted for Donald Trump.
And yes, and that is going to be, that has already, I mean, the election of people like Kemi Badenoch as leader of the Tory party, minorities rising to government positions in the last Conservative, these things already are a sign that the majority in England is a larger and more diverse one. I mean, and I'm not using diverse as a form of praise there, merely as a fact. And that has already happened in America, and it's going to happen in all Western countries. But it's a battle against time, because until that happens, the governments like Starmer and Macron are really going to be on the side not of the minorities, so to speak, as against the majority, and that's the danger.
Well, I'll wrap this up and then we'll go to our final topic, but I want to say this. In the past week, I've read one of the most extraordinary books I've ever seen. It's called Secondhand Time, The Last of the Soviets, by a woman, a Russian journalist named Svetlana Alexievich. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature for her work. And it is an oral history of the fall of the Soviet Union as told by ordinary people, from a variety of people. It ties into what we're talking about here, because some of these testimonies are from ethnic Russians who lived in some of the Soviet republics, non-Russian republics. There's one woman who lived in Baku in Azerbaijan. She was an Armenian, ethnic Armenian. She married an Azerbaijani Muslim. And then the system falls, the Soviet system falls. All of the people who were their friends, their neighbors, with whom they'd got along quite well for decades, suddenly turned on them, started cutting throats. And it's not just an anti-Russian thing. The Alexievich interviews a Tajik woman in Moscow whose job it is to defend the put-upon Tajiks. And they were horribly treated by ethnic Russians. My point is simply this. None of these people expected their neighbors to turn on them. But when the canopy of protection of the state, the idea of the state fell, it was back to blood and religion. So I think that's something we ought to keep in mind, that it was absolutely horrible, just gut-wrenching what happened. And it happened like that. Now, final question. We're talking about adolescence and this fake, or this fictional thing that Keir Starmer wants people to believe is real. What real-life story would you like to see turned into a docudrama in order to change the political debate?
Well, for me, it's very easy. I would like to see a serious Netflix drama on the rape gangs, and it's the most straightforward answer. I mean, it is still utterly remarkable that we don't have something like that. What we do have, by the way, is a BBC drama based on one case out of, let's say, 10,000 of a young white girl who lied about being a victim of grooming gangs. Now, the BBC felt that was appropriate content, and we should do that. But we have never really had, as I say, a serious reckoning with what is going to go down as the most horrific scandal in British history. We should have a Netflix documentary on the rape gangs, and it should be grounded in fact and reality.
I would like to see a docudrama about the making of a docudrama about the rape gangs. It would require Evil in War to do justice to it, but it would turn out at the end to be a demonstration that we must increase immigration in order to bring greater harmony to the British people. I have complete faith in the media class you were describing before, in their ability to make something quite riveting about that. And it would be interesting to see. We'd all take bets on the ratings it got, because I don't think you can pull off twice the trick that Keir Starmer has pulled here, in which he's persuaded people in advance that they have to like, approve of, and watch something which, if they were to view it critically, as some people have done, like Ed West, turns out to be just flim-flam.
Okay, so we talked briefly about the bin strikes in Birmingham. So the bin strikes, and there are trash can strikes in America. So Birmingham is just, the streets are full of rubbish. This is Britain's second biggest city. And the reason for that is an equal pay claim, which dates back to this piece of legislation called the Equalities Act 2010. Which creates this sort of slightly Soviet commissar-style system whereby a judge can say, well, these jobs have equal merit. And so the bin men, the trash can men, were paid X amount, and then people who sort of worked in canteens for the local council were paid that amount, and the mainly women who were paid a lower amount went to court to get all of the back pay. Because they argued that their case was equivalent to the job of the people doing the bins. And then this kind of, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that is why Birmingham Council is now bankrupt. And this strike cannot finish until a point when, it's unclear when that point would be, because basically they would have to then not only compensate the bin men at a higher level, they would have to then compensate everyone else at a higher level.
So why a docudrama?
Because there is this sort of twee theme in British culture. There was a film, do you remember the Full Monty? That's kind of the classic version of it. And then there was another film a lot like that called Made in Dagenham, about women in the 1960s at the Ford factory in Dagenham striking for actual equal pay, for the same amount of pay. And my idea is that the first half of this film would just be like the sort of twee British comedy vibes and, sort of all of that. And then the second half is basically J.G. Ballard's High Rise, and you just move through Birmingham, and these sort of like people being raped without street lamps and so on and so forth.
You could have a drone like in Syria, but it just sort of goes slowly down the Birmingham streets, showing the piles of rubbish.
Yeah, what is the first line of High Rise? He felt much better after he ate the dog.
Well, in my case, there's actually a documentary out now. It came out in April this month about one of my books called Live Not by Lies. And this book came out in 2020, became a bestseller, and it is about the testimonies that people in the Soviet bloc who stayed and lived under communism and were dissidents and lived through it. It's about their warnings to we in the West about what they consider to be a form of soft totalitarianism emerging here. We've been talking about it the whole time. The fact that you can't speak about what's actually happening in front of you without risking jail. So the documentary is out. It's on angel.com. You can pay to stream it. But I was thinking, watching one of the episodes, there's a family that's sort of the center of the documentary, the Benda family in Prague. They were a family, a Catholic family with 6 kids. Václav Benda, the patriarch, he went to jail for 4 years as a political prisoner. And his wife, his heroic wife, kept the family together. Now, these were the only Catholics and right-wingers at the center of the Czech resistance, at the high level there. What's so extraordinary about this family is they were at the same time an ordinary family. You can see in the documentary, in the second episode, some archival footage from the BBC, I think it was. They sent a camera in there in the 1980s when communism was in full flower, and they recorded the Bendas talking about whether or not to fly the Czech flag, Czechoslovak flag, from their window on the day to celebrate the communist takeover. And you see in real time these parents, and you can see Camilla, the mom, is really scared. The little children all around, they're talking about, should we do this? Camilla says to her husband, he's a mathematician who's been forced to be a stoker because he's a dissident. Camilla says, well, the people, our neighbors here in the building say, come on, we love your kids. Don't make it hard for them. Just conform, just conform. And the mom and dad debate it and decide in the end, no, we can't do that, because they don't want their children to look at them and see them as cowards. Now, it brings tears to my eyes because I know this woman, Camilla. I've been to that very apartment. But to see her and him, he died in 99, but to see them as having to make this decision in real time with their little children around them, knowing this could get them all thrown in prison, it's extraordinary. And I really would love to see a drama made about that family and what it had to go through as a symbol of what so many of them had to go through, with this exception. Camilla told me when I interviewed her in her apartment for my book, I said, was it hard for you all to be Catholics here working with Václav Havel and the others? They were all hippies. She said, no, not at all. Because when you choose to stand against totalitarianism, courage is the thing you must look for in allies above all else. She said, Rod, you mustn't think that all of our fellow Catholics were brave. Most of them kept their heads down just like everybody else. But my husband and I knew that before God, we could not do that. So we had to look for others who were brave too. And it turned out to be these hippies and even a disillusioned Trotskyist. So all of this is so fascinating. It is a documentary now, Live Not by Lies, but it can make fantastic drama. And by the way, if you go on Netflix now, it's very hard to find anything about communism. Lots and lots of stuff about Nazism, and there should be. We shouldn't forget it. Yeah. Communism has been memory holed. Interesting. Yes. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this week on View from the Danube. Gavin Haynes, John O'Sullivan, Matt Goodwin. Check out Matt's Substack. What's the address?
Just mattgoodwin.org. Thank you.
Mattgoodwin.org. And thanks again for joining us. I'm Rod Dreher. See you next time.